Today we will explore how the younger brother complex plays out in contemporary Russia and how it played out in the Nazi Germany, and why it's not just about them, but it's about all of us. So, what if I told you that we can understand nations the way we understand individuals? If you take a look at the collective society of a given nation as a single individual, then you'll be able to sort of psychoanalyze the entire nation. Just like a person, a nation can have a shadow, it can have a wounded ego, it can even have a complex, right, that shapes how it behaves in that world. Now, in my previous video, I did mention that politics is essentially an illusion. If you're interested, you can go check that out. But Jung believed that mass movements and national moods were not random. They were the expression of a collective psyche, and when that psyche is wounded, repressed, or split, it simply acts out, just like what's happening in today's Russia. All right, so what is the younger brother complex? I think the best way we can take a look at what the younger brother complex is to take a look at the biblical story of Cain and Abel, where there's the archetype of the rejected sibling, right? One brother kills the other essentially out of envy, right? This can also be seen in modern myths like Marvel, where Loki is envious of Thor. Now, this complex does not just show itself in individuals, but as I mentioned, you can analyze a nation as an individual, therefore, it can be mirrored in nations. And you can see this psychological pattern of inferiority, resentment, and overcompensation manifest itself in today's Russian Federation. But going back to Germany after World War I, you can see that Germany was in a very humiliated position. They lost a world war. Um, they were in an economic crisis. And on top of that, they were lagging behind in the colonial game that other nations, big nations, were playing at the time. Right? France and the UK and America were big players on the world stage, and they colonized a lot of the world. Right? And Germany was lagging behind in this colonial game. So, for all of these reasons, there's this sort of inferiority and rage that manifested itself in the German society. And the German people were essentially projecting onto Hitler all of these things unconsciously. Hitler was representing the myth of Wotan. In Jung's view, Hitler was the embodiment of Wotan, the mythic figure, the Germanic pagan god Wotan, the god of wind. And you can actually see itself manifest unconsciously in the German symbolism. So, for instance, if you take a look at the Nazi swastika, it was swirling leftward. It was symbolizing a storm, a tornado that was to sweep the entire nation and the entire continent, and perhaps even the entire world. Now, this symbolism goes even deeper than that. For instance, you can see it in the naming, right? Sturmabteilung, the storm division, the word storm, right? Remember, Wotan is the god of wind, god of storm. You can also spot it in, for example, the SS, right? The symbolism that they used, those two lightning bolts, that goes back to Wotan, right? The god of storm and wind. Now, Russia is going through a similar identity crisis with the West, and fundamentally, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet ideology failed, as all ideologies are bound to fail eventually. In the Soviet ideology, the boss was fundamentally the demigod. It was a religion, because if you take a man's religion away, he's bound to seek it elsewhere, whether it be consumerism, whether it be communism, or whichever ideology or mass movement. So man found this religion within communism. The same thing the Nazis were doing when they were stamping out religion, because they fundamentally wanted to replace religion with Hitlerism. Just like the Soviets were trying to replace religion with communism. That's why they were so opposed to religions, and they were trying to root out the church and get rid of it. Because in the communist state, there's also a paradox that it fundamentally stands for the commune, right? For community, but it was actually opposed to the community eventually, and it was oppressing people on a mass scale. In the communist state, in the communist religion, the service to the state is the form of ultimate worship. So you can see how these unconsciously, this religiosity shows itself within the communist ideology. Now, after the post-Soviet collapse, it created a sort of void in the Russian society. And Putin is trying to restore this myth. He's trying to bring back the Soviet era, the nostalgia. You can see a sort of projection of strength, right? Putin is trying to project strength, and this fundamentally masks an inner fragmentation. In my previous video on what the West gets wrong about Russia, some of my viewers suggested that Russia is actually fragmenting on the inside because Russia is, of course, a federation. So all of the states within Russia are fundamentally seeking independence. And Putin is trying to use this myth of the Soviet era to restore unity within Russia. Now, I personally noticed a very interesting thing that the Russians started using the Z symbol to represent the anti-Western movement within Russia, and the ultra-nationalist circles within Russia cling onto that symbol as fundamentally the anti-Western symbol. Now, there's a lot of irony and paradox in that. You might think that the Z symbol is just strictly related to military, but that's not true. It was actually picked unconsciously, I believe, and the reason being is that the Z letter is not at all in the Russian alphabet. If you take a look at it this way, the Russians ultimately took something from Western culture, appropriated it, assimilated it as their own symbol, and they're ultimately using the Z symbol to define themselves, right? Because this entire younger brother complex that's taking place in current Russia is an identity crisis that the nation is going through. So you can see this psychological projection taking place in Russia. It it portrays the West as the embodiment of pure evil. Since Russia is ultimately projecting onto the West, and the West, do not forget, is projecting onto Russia, because ultimately Westerners tend to view Putin as the embodiment of pure evil. But Putin is not the reason. He is just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Now, you can also notice that there's this parallel between the Nazi Germany and contemporary Russia, where the Nazis were projecting onto the Jews. The Nazis would blame the Jews for raping German women. They would blame the Jews for stealing. They would blame the Jews for being greedy. But it was the Nazis themselves who were treating their women like breeding cows for soldiers. It was the Nazis who were stealing property, right? Who were stealing gold just to keep it to themselves. So everything that they blamed the Jews of is what they were doing. And the same thing is taking place in current Russia. You can see how Russia is projecting onto the West. They say that the West does not stand for family values, but Russia, if you take a look at the current government policies, is treating their own women as breeding cows, right? Giving them money just to breed more soldiers. And it's very important to become conscious of this, because not only is Russia projecting onto the West is also projecting onto Russia. Maybe what could help us understand this entire concept better is a quote from Carl Jung, specifically from the Collected Works, where Jung says, "A group experience takes place on a lower level of consciousness than the experience of an individual. This is due to the fact that when many people gather together to share a common emotion, the total psyche emerging from the group is below the level of the individual psyche. If it is a very large group, the collective psyche will be more like the psyche of an animal, which is the reason why the ethical attitude of large organizations is always doubtful. The psychology of a large crowd inevitably sinks to the level of mob psychology. If, therefore, I have a so-called collective experience as a member of a group, it takes place on a lower level of consciousness than if I had the experience by myself alone. That is why group experience is very much more frequent than an individual experience of transformation." So there's a lot that Jung is saying in these sentences, and to put it bluntly, what Jung is essentially trying to point out here is that big crowds, right, big crowds of people often lose their sense of personal responsibility, and they become more like animals, because fundamentally it touches our animalistic, tribalistic part, driven by instinct instead of reflection. That's why big groups can do things individuals might never consider doing alone. That is why, if you take a look at Nazi Germany, there were people within the Nazi Party who joined the Nazi Party, right? They were good people, fundamentally good people, but they joined the Nazi Party, and this psychological infection spread onto them, and they committed crimes worse than they could ever imagine. So the fundamental lesson here is that this issue is not a national issue. It's not Putin's fault. It's not Stalin's fault. It's fundamentally a human issue. Right now, you might be thinking to yourself, so if this is a human issue, where's the solution? Are we just going to repeat these cycles of wars and dictatorships? Well, the solution lies within the individual, within you, within me. You might be thinking to yourself that the individual, if you take a look at society at large, humanity at large, that the individual is very insignificant. From the statistical point of view, one human being is essentially just a number among millions, among billions. But it is precisely that one person, meaning you, meaning me, the individual, who is responsible for individuation, for becoming conscious of the unconscious. Unless people start becoming conscious of the unconscious, the cycle of wars, dictatorships, and suffering is going to keep repeating itself. So ultimately, the answer lies within you and how you are going to tackle your own mind. The bottom line is, we are not supposed to be fighting external wars or having external revolutions. We're supposed to be fighting internally, right? Every day, you're supposed to fight your shadow. You're supposed to fight the inner darkness that's within you. You're supposed to face it. You're not supposed to run away from it. Otherwise, it's going to possess you, and it's going to make you commit crimes worse than you can imagine. And that is why the average individual is capable of great evil. He's just not conscious of it. And that's the biggest problem that humanity right now is facing, because the future of our world hangs on a very thin thread, and that is the psyche of the individual, right? We are the ultimate demise of ourselves unless we individuate. So, to conclude on this quote from Jung, essentially, if you have a powerful experience as part of a group, whether it be at a party, whether it be a political movement, it usually affects you on a shallower level than if you had gone through the same experience just by yourself. Real transformation happens when you are alone, because that is precisely when you're truly facing yourself. And one of the biggest problems that we face today is that people are just swiping and scrolling on their devices. They're not paying attention to themselves. They're not paying attention to their own mind,